Okay. So we're recording now, and I could just begin.
No, let me just introduce you, okay?
All right.
This will be a quick introduction. Let me get the link to the course. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our graduate seminar in neurophilosophy at the graduate program in philosophy at the Catholic University of Porto Alegre. We are very pleased to announce today Professor John Bolender from the Federal University of Espírito Santo. John Bolender has a PhD in philosophy from Columbia University. Prior to that, he got a master's in philosophy from New York University and did his undergraduate work in philosophy at University of Michigan. John has been teaching for many years in Brazil. We had the privilege of hearing many of his talks on Wittgenstein, Chomsky, and philosophy of mind in this very seminar in neurophilosophy in our program. And very recently, Professor Bolender has published some seminal works on philosophy of mind, precisely and more specifically on logical forms. And we are very glad that he's going to share with us some ideas about his ongoing research. Thank you very much, John. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this forum. And I'm going to begin just by stating the title, Magical Thinking in Philosophy. There's a great deal of magical thinking in religion, but a taboo against calling it magical. And hold on just a second. Something changed, which made it difficult for me to move the slides. Something has changed. I'm not able to move the slides now. I'm stuck on the first slide. And also, I cannot hear you. Well,
tá sem microfone.
Okay. Hold on just a second now.
Continua sem microfone.
I should change microphones.
Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm talking to Professor Nitamari was without the micro. Sorry.
Right. Please
you
go ahead.
You can hear me now, okay, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, all right. Now, magical thinking in philosophy. So I begin just by running through the initial slides quickly, and then I discuss the following slides in more detail. Magical thinking in philosophy. There's a great deal of magical thinking in religion, but a taboo against calling it magical. And likewise, there's a great deal of magical thinking in philosophy, but a taboo against calling it magical. And okay, this is the next slide, right? Apparently I don't have control over the slides. Nitamar has control over the slides. Which means I think I will have to indicate verbally somehow when the next slide is ready.
All right.
So I'm ready for the next slide now. Magical contagion. Okay, so we're going to begin by focusing on a specific type of magical thinking. That way we don't have to worry about defining magical thinking in general. We can just focus on one subcase of magical thinking. And we can begin with at least a rough characterization of what that kind of magical thinking is. Oh, okay. No, back, please. That's it. Okay. This is a quote okay, from a psychological article, and it indicates the fact that that this is a subject of research for psychologists. The concept of contagion was first articulated by anthropologists in the late 19th century. No, that's not the right slide. Okay. The concept of contagion was first articulated by anthropologists in the late 19th century to describe a set of cultural practices related to the transfer of unseen properties. In particular, people across several different cultures seem to hold the belief that objects could acquire the aura or essence of a particular source through physical contact with that source. And let's stay on this slide. Let's stay here for a while, okay? Now, I want to emphasize the word unseen, the transfer of unseen properties. The invisibility or undetectability of the properties is important. And we're going to return to that later and talk about it. I also want to talk about this phrase, the aura or essence. It's a little bit, it will strike some of you as a little bit unclear as to just what they're talking about. And there are a couple of things I want to say about this. One is that magical thinking is an empirical phenomenon. It's a psychological phenomenon. It's a certain kind of thinking. And so we have to begin with a rough characterization, and then we precisify, as they say. We make it more precise as we go along by doing investigation. Okay? The word essence is important. I think it's unfortunate that they put the word essence in scare quotes because that seems to downplay its importance. When you look at the literature on magical contagion, essence does appear to be very important. Supposedly, for someone who believes in magical contagion, when one object makes contact with another, the object, some of the essence rubs off. The second object acquires some of the essence from the first object. Or, at the very least, there's some sort of connection with the essence. Some sort of linkage is maintained with the essence from the initial object. And I want to emphasize that essence is really important here. And we will keep returning to this notion of essence, how magical contagion either transmits essence in the philosophical sense of essential properties, real definitions. It either transmits essence or it transmits some kind of linkage or connection to essence. And so by means of history, one object will be connected to the essence of another object. And now let's go to the next slide, please. I'm ready for the next slide. Can you hear me? I'm ready for the next slide, the following slide.
Yes.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay. This is a quote from the book of Acts in the Bible. God did extraordinary miracles through Paul, so that when the handkerchiefs or aprons that had touched his skin were brought to the sick, their diseases left them and the evil spirits came out of them. So this is an example of magical contagion. It's in a religious context, so that relates back to one theme I alluded to earlier. But it's also an illustration of magical contagion per se. Paul makes contact with a handkerchief. I don't know if this is a handkerchief or not, but Paul makes contact with a handkerchief. He just makes contact with it. Paul had the power to heal people, according to Acts. The handkerchief later makes contact with a sick person, and the sick person becomes well. Okay? It's because of an invisible change, and I want to emphasize that word invisible. And it's also because the handkerchief maintains a connection with Paul's essence. And I want to emphasize another point, which may remind you of philosophy a little bit. I hope it does. If you had two handkerchiefs that were perfect duplicates of one another, perfect replicas, physically indistinguishable, but one of those handkerchiefs had contacted Paul's body and the other handkerchief had not, you know that the first handkerchief would have magical power and the second one would not. So it's something like twin earth, which is something we'll get back to later, okay? Okay. So essence is transmitted invisibly, undetectably. It's only detectable in terms of the expression of the magical power itself. Now, we can go to the next slide, the following slide. Thank you. Now, this is very similar. This is from a book called Chronicle of the Crusades, written by Sébastien Mamereau in the Middle Ages. And this particular part of the book concerns the reign of the Emperor Charlemagne. So it's well before the 1400s. And it takes place in the Hagia Sophia Church in Constantinople. And it concerns the Holy Nail. Now, the Holy Nail, as you can probably figure out easily, the Holy Nail would have been a spike driven through the flesh of Christ when he was crucified, right? Okay, now quoting from Mamereau, when the Holy Nail was taken from the casket by Bishop Damel, a great, marvelous, and pleasant smell filled the place in the church where it was, but none could find words adequate to describe it. And a like miracle spread throughout the city on men of various standing who were in that place. And so great was it that thanks to the great healing power of this smell, 301 who were sick with diverse illnesses were cured at that very moment. And you'll notice this is very similar to the example of St. Paul and the apron or handkerchief. And you'll also notice that the magical power in the nail is invisible. It's undetectable, except via the expression of the power itself. You could have two nails, absolutely indistinguishable. One made contact with the body of Christ, the other didn't. And you know that the first one would have magic powers and the second one wouldn't, right? Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Oliver Lodge. Oliver Lodge was a physicist who lived roughly 100 years ago. And he was a highly respected physicist, and he was brilliant. He was also an engineer. He played a role in the invention of the radio. So the radio was not just the invention of Tesla and Marconi, but Oliver Lodge also played a role. Despite all of that, Oliver Lodge believed in the occult. He was an occultist. And he tried to show that the occult is scientifically respectable. And here in his book, Phantom Walls, he also describes a kind of magical contagion. Quoting Lodge, "It is certain that an object with a history attached to it does seem to enable a sensitive person to decipher some of that history. Robert Browning, the poet, narrated an episode of that kind in connection with a ring which had belonged to a murdered man. So presumably a ring had belonged to a murdered man. A sensitive person who knew nothing about the murder touched the ring and then knew something about the murder, knew who committed it, knew how it was done, and so on, okay? And I also want to emphasize this is an unseen power in the ring. So you could have two identical rings. I keep emphasizing this. You could have two molecule for molecule identical rings. One ring belonged to the murdered man. The other ring didn't. And you know that the ring that belonged to the murdered man would transmit information about the murder to this sensitive person, yeah? And not the other ring, right? Okay, now this does illustrate that highly educated people can believe in magic, which is a theme I want to expand upon because it's pretty important. The next slide, please. Let's go to the next one. Can we go to the following slide? Can you hear me? The following slide about.
I know, John. For some reason, this system is really getting into trouble. I've never seen this before. Are you using a different software for the presentation? For some reason, it's not showing here for me now.
Oh, I thought you were using your own software. You're not. You're using my software.
No, must be
you're using my software.
It sounds like magical Contagion.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I thought you were. I thought you were using your own copy. Let me.
No, it's back now.
It's different software here.
Let me see if it's.
Is it different now?
No, let me see. Let me resume it from where it was. But for some reason, I have the impression that it's yeah, I can no longer control it. Yeah, are you projecting yourself from there?
I'm not sure what's happening actually.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Not in control of it.
Yeah, let me see once again. Let's see. All right.
Okay. Now can we go to the, okay, this is it. This is it. Okay, great. The next slide, this is it. Okay, highly educated people tend not to want to wear clothing worn by an AIDS patient, even though they know consciously that there's no risk of infection. Now here we have not only magical thinking among highly educated people, but we have magical thinking which is apparently unconscious. And this is extremely important. People have an unconscious tendency to think magically. And this is very well documented. Here, I'm citing a single paper, but there's a big stack of papers on this topic. It's very well documented that highly educated people tend to believe in magic on an unconscious level. They tend not to want to touch something if they think that it belonged to Adolf Hitler, or you get the idea, right? It's like they think that some of Hitler's essence rubbed off onto it, or in fact, we'll give further examples of this. Can we advance to the next slide, hopefully? Yes. Okay, very good. Belief in contagious diseases is not currently magical thinking because we've discovered the previously invisible agents. In other words, the difference made by contact is now detectable. And here I want to bring up another theme, because this is actually a complex topic, and I really don't mean to oversimplify it. It's not clear that magical thinking is always irrational. Here, we can think of an historical context in which one could perhaps argue that magical thinking was rational. Let's say that during the Middle Ages, you had one group of people who insisted that certain diseases were transmitted by touch. And you had other people who said, no, that's not true at all. Those diseases are caused by demonic possession. Now, you could argue that the first group of people are thinking magically, that they believe in magical contagion. Even so, in some sense, it seems like the first group are more rational than the second group. In the Middle Ages, it's a little bit more rational to believe that disease, it depends on the disease. We're not talking about cancer, you know, but it depends on the disease. But it's a little bit more rational to believe that disease is transmitted by magical contagion than to believe that it's the result of demonic possession. Okay, so that's another complex issue. Is magical thinking always irrational? Now let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now this is really interesting, and I assume that most of you or all of you have heard of the Salvator Mundi. You're familiar with this, I think, right? It's the most expensive painting in the world. It's a portrait of Christ that evidently was painted by Leonardo da Vinci, but there was for a time some debate as to who actually painted it, okay? And here's a quote from the New York Times. A team of French scientists subjected the unframed canvas to a weeks-long forensic examination with some of the most advanced technology available to the art world. And in their undisclosed report, they had pronounced with more authority than any previous assessment that the painting appeared to be the work of Leonardo's own hand. Now we're talking about highly educated people, art experts. They care very much about the value of this painting. In fact, they evaluate the value of the painting. They determine the value of the painting. And they determine it partly on the basis of who painted it. In other words, the value of the painting is not wholly a function of the intrinsic properties of the painting. It's partly a function of where it came from. So you could have two I don't want to say two Salvator Mundis, because strictly speaking, I guess that's impossible. But you could have the Salvator Mundi painted by Da Vinci, and you could have a perfect duplicate of the Salvator Mundi painted by his pupil Salé. Was that his name? I know he had several pupils. You could have a perfect duplicate of the Salvator Mundi painted by Salé. And then you could have the actual Salvator Mundi painted by Da Vinci. And you know that the more valuable one is the one painted by Da Vinci. Now, isn't this a kind of magical thinking? It's not the intrinsic properties of the painting that determine its value, but whether or not Da Vinci, so to speak, poured himself into the painting. Whether or not Da Vinci's essence rubbed off onto the painting in the process of creating it. That determines its value. And these are highly educated people, these art experts. And I hesitate to say that they're being irrational, because it's an important part of our culture that we care about the provenance of a work of art, even though I believe this to be magical contagion. All of this concern about provenance is actually magical contagion, or belief in magical contagion. At the same time, though, it's so integral to our culture, it's so much a part of who we are, I hesitate to call it irrational. So there are several things I could point to here. Highly educated people can believe in magical thinking. In this case, the magical thinking seems to be kind of half conscious, half unconscious, I would say. Furthermore, it's not absolutely clear that the magical thinking is wrong. A space alien might think that it's irrational. But from the perspective of a human being, it doesn't seem so irrational to care about this, to care about whether Da Vinci painted it or someone else painted it. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Amedeo Modigliani, an Italian artist, and Elmir Dahori, a Hungarian artist, but he's mainly known as a forger. He created forgeries of works of art, including Modigliani's. He was not creating duplicates. He was not creating duplicates, which might actually be an honest living, creating a duplicate and selling it as a duplicate. He was creating different paintings, but in a style that was indistinguishable from Modigliani. And not only Modigliani, but also Matisse and other artists. And Dahori, he was so good at this, he would take these forged paintings and he would convince art experts that they were genuine, and he would sell them to museums. And of course, when he was discovered, well, I'm not sure what happened to him. I know eventually he committed suicide for some reason, but when he was discovered, obviously there was a problem because this was a crime, right? Now, here we also have magical contagion. A genuine Modigliani, aesthetically speaking, a genuine of course, it may depend on what you mean by aesthetic. But in terms of just like the appearance, okay, aesthetically speaking, a genuine Modigliani is not different in any significant way from a forgery by Dohori. Okay, but the art experts were fooled, so that's how I can say this with confidence. And yet, most people would agree, maybe not everybody, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people would agree that the genuine Modigliani has more value than the fake Modigliani. And it's because Modigliani himself, I almost want to use the language of John Locke, is because Modigliani mixed his labor with it, which may also be a kind of magical contagion, mixing one's labor with something. This concept in Locke. And now we're finally mentioning philosophy, but we'll get back to philosophy in a moment. It's like Modigliani put part of himself into the painting, some of his essence. And for that reason, an actual Modigliani is of more value than a forgery by Dohori. And this is just an intuition of ours. It's not based on anything objective. It's just how we tend to think. And apparently, it's a belief in magical contagion. Okay, let's go into the next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, and finally, we're talking about something straightforwardly philosophical here. And this, I take it, is familiar. I asked if you were familiar with the Salvator Mundi, and you said yes. So now I'm going to ask if you're familiar with Twin Earth. And most of you are familiar with Twin Earth, or all of you are. The Twin Earth thought experiment. All of you are, or no?
Maybe you can explain shortly.
Well, let me just begin by reading the quote, so we don't get lost in the quote. Quoting Hilary Putnam, what the word water referred to in Earth English was H2O. The word water in Twin Earth English referred to XYZ. To say that this is what the word water referred to in the two dialects is just to say that this is what the word denoted or was true of. Now, this comment pertains to a thought experiment by Hilary Putnam, which I insist has to do with magical contagion, although on the face of it, it might seem to be unrelated. Putnam conducts a thought experiment in which he asks us to imagine something initially rather ordinary. He asks us to imagine a man named Oscar, and Oscar, has a glass of water, and he makes some really trivial statements. Oscar says, "This is water," and then Oscar also observes that water is wet, quite accurately, very, very trivially. Now, Putnam asks us to imagine something exotic. He asks us to imagine that there's a planet in another star system that's a duplicate for duplicate, molecule for molecule duplicate of the planet Earth, with one exception. In place of the molecule H2O, one finds some other molecule, which we don't really know what it is, but Putnam calls it XYZ. And on Twin Earth, which is the name of this planet, there is a twin Oscar. There's a twin for every Earthling. And twin Oscar, he also picks up a glass of something that looks like water to us. He picks up a glass of something, and he makes the noise, "This is water, and water is wet." But given the fact that what is in the glass on Twin Earth is not H2O, that means it's not really water, according to Putnam. Even though it looks like water, tastes like water, the oceans are filled with XYZ, it rains XYZ, and so on. So according to Putnam, When twin Oscar says, this is water, the word water does not refer to H2O. When Oscar uses the word water, his water, the word, refers to H2O. When twin Oscar uses the word water, his water, the word, refers to XYZ. And this means, at the very least, it means that content, as they call it, whether it's mental content or verbal significance, content is partially externalistically constituted, or it's sometimes put that way. That content is not just a matter of what's going on inside the cranium or inside the organism, but content is partly a matter of what's going on inside the environment. And note, and here the thought experiment becomes more relevant to our current discussion. Note that according to Putnam, content is also partially historically constituted. So if you were to use a teletransportation device and you were to switch Oscar and twin Oscar without their knowing it, so that all of a sudden Oscar is on twin Earth and twin Oscar is on Earth, and twin Oscar on Earth is holding this glass of water and saying, that's water and water is wet, he's still referring to XYZ because of his history, right? And this is the intuition that many people have. Maybe not everybody, but there are some people who challenge the intuition. But I want to suggest, well, first of all, I mean, all of you can see what the intuition is, right? Intuitively, the reference of one's terms is historically constituted, at least partly. This looks something like magical contagion, because what it means is that Oscar's word water refers to H2O, partly because of prior contact which Oscar has had with H2O. Even if you put him on a different planet, his word water still refers to H2O. And vice versa, twin Oscar. Twin Oscar's water, his word water in twin English, refers to XYZ because of contact which he's had with XYZ in the past. Because of this previous contact, because of prior contact, there's a connection to the essence. So Oscar's idiolect, the language that he speaks, has a connection to the essence of water, which for Putnam is H2O. Just like for Saul Kripke, the essence of water is H2O, right? Oscar's language has a connection to the essence of water, just as the idiolect of twin Oscar has a connection to the essence of twin water, which is XYZ. Okay? And I'm suggesting that these intuitions have their basis in a belief in magical contagion, which we know that highly educated people can believe in, and highly educated people can be motivated by magical thinking unconsciously, which I suggest is what we're seeing here. And let's go to another example. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is the swamp man thought experiment of Donald Davidson. Okay, it's like Twin Earth, but it's more dramatic. Quoting Davidson, suppose lightning strikes a dead tree in a swamp. I am standing nearby. My body is reduced to its elements, while entirely by coincidence and out of different molecules, the tree is turned into my physical replica. So once again, we have replicas. Like we have two individuals who are replicas all the way down to the subatomic level, presumably. Okay, so this links back to the notion of invisibility. The magical contagion is transmitted invisibly. It's not detectable. Okay, so you could have replicas. One replica would transmit the contagion and the other would not transmit it, despite the fact that they're empirically indistinguishable. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. Someone may have asked a question, but I'm not able to see it because my picture frame blocked it. But okay, continuing with the slide. My replica cannot mean what I do by the word house, for example, since the sound house it makes was not learned in a context that would give it the right meaning or any meaning at all. Is someone asking me a question? I'm not able to see it, but I think it might be better to ask questions at the end, because that way the full meaning of what I'm saying will be more apparent. But my own picture frame, literally my own picture frame on the screen was just blocks out the pop-up. So my replica cannot mean what I do by the word house, for example, since the sound house it makes was not learned in a context that would give it the right meaning or any meaning at all. So the Swamp Man, which is the name of Putnam's doppelganger, the name of his duplicate. The Swamp Man is not capable of any language at all, because the sounds that he makes, the vocal sounds that he makes, which sound like language, would not have any meaning because he doesn't have the right history. In fact, he has no history. That's the whole point of the Swamp Man, no history at all. And going on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Indeed, I don't see how my replica can be said to mean anything by the sounds it makes, nor to have any thoughts. And the idea here is that the Swamp Man, in other words, Davidson's duplicate, his replica, has not had prior contact with anything, and for that reason is not capable of any semantics, is not capable of any verbal significance, is not capable of any mental content. Okay. And this, at least my impression is, this looks like the doctrine that an individual picks up mental contents by means of contact with essences in their environment. Okay. And it does not supervene on anything intrinsic to the organism. Well, partly it does. But content does not wholly supervene on what's intrinsic to the organism, but partly supervenes on history, because the organism picks up connections with essences, like H2O, for example, due to its prior contacts with the environment. Okay. In other words, Swamp Man is only capable of counterfeit thoughts, not real thoughts, because Swamp Man doesn't have the right history. Just like a pseudo-Modigliani by De Hore is a counterfeit because it doesn't have the right history. It didn't make the right contact with Modigliani. I view this as similar, and given the fact that human beings have an unconscious tendency to think magically, and there's a large literature on this, I think we should at least consider the possibility that there's some magical thinking going on here. And let's go on to the next slide. Okay, thank you. Now, for a little bit of anthropology, and it might look like we're going off topic a little bit, but we'll get back to philosophy soon enough. Anthropologists Roy Dandrad and Richard Schwader proposed a theory of magical thinking in terms of unintuitive versus intuitive thinking. Their examples of unintuitive thinking are various forms of correlational reasoning. Now, what they're going to say is that correlational reasoning, which is basically probabilistic or statistical reasoning, is difficult for human beings. And magical thinking, by contrast, is very natural and intuitive for human beings. Okay? And because statistical thinking is difficult, we tend to fall back on magical thinking as a substitute for correlational thinking. And this may not immediately appear to pertain to philosophy, but I'll explain what the connection is as we go along. Okay, so on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Magical thinking is an expression of a universal disinclination of normal adults to draw correlational lessons from their experience, coupled with a universal inclination to seek symbolic and meaningful connections among objects and events. In other words, people are not very good at probabilistic thinking, but they are very good at seeking meaning amongst events. Okay, and let's go to the next slide. When normal adults make personality assessments, items of conduct that resemble one another, such as smiles easily, introduces himself to strangers, likes parties, are typically said to co-vary over people despite experience and available information to the contrary. Now, you have to understand Schrader's terminology here. When he talks about items of conduct that resemble one another, a term that might be more familiar to philosophers is semantic closeness. He's talking about expressions that are semantically close. I know that semantic closeness is a phrase that at least Jerry Fodor would use, right? So the phrase smiles easily, introduces himself to strangers, likes parties, those phrases are semantically close, meaning that they're similar in meaning. And they're similar in meaning, at the very least, because they all go toward making up the definition of extroversion. You could define an extrovert using that terminology, okay? And because they're semantically close, people, even including psychologists, at least back in the 60s and 70s, psychologists had a tendency to make mistakes. They would think that they were seeing correlations when they were not seeing correlations. In their work, they would think that they were seeing a correlation between smiling easily and liking parties, when in fact, the evidence does not support that correlation. Okay? You see, I'm smiling easily right now, and I don't like parties, so that proves the point, right? Schrader and also Dendrad, they were pointing out that when terms are semantically close, people naturally tend to think that they co-occur, because the alternative, which is to think in terms of statistics and probability and correlation, is much, much harder. Okay. So we have this distinction between intuitive thinking, which includes magical thinking, and unintuitive thinking, which includes correlational reasoning. Now, at a later point in the talk, I'm going to expand upon this distinction. I'm going to distinguish intuitive thinking, which includes magical thinking, and unintuitive thinking, which also includes philosophy. Philosophical thinking is very unintuitive. And because it's unintuitive, we tend to fall back upon magical thinking as a crutch. That's what I want to say. Okay. Now, whether or not that's a bad thing is a tricky question. I've already tried to emphasize that magical thinking is not always irrational. But I do think that we tend to do that. Okay, now going on to the next slide. In other words, people find it more intuitive and natural to associate things whose corresponding verbal expressions are semantically close, rather than take the trouble of examining actual correlations. Okay. In other words, people have trouble with probabilities. Unless they've taken a course in statistics, people tend to get probabilities wrong. Okay. And so instead of relying on probabilities, they think in terms of semantic closeness, because that's much easier. Okay. Now going on to the next slide. Now this is to illustrate Schrader's theory of magical thinking. The verbal expressions, the Apostle Paul, an apron touched by the Apostle Paul, are semantically close because they have overlapping constituents. So we tend to associate them. And that's where this idea of magical contagion comes from. We tend to associate apron touched by Paul with Paul himself. And note the same can be said for Leonardo da Vinci and portrait largely painted by Leonardo da Vinci. Okay. We tend to associate the two, we tend to associate da Vinci with Salvator Mundi because the descriptions of the two overlap. And that makes us feel like there's a really solid connection between the two, despite the fact that da Vinci died centuries ago and Mundi has been in all these different countries and so forth. But we still feel there's a very strong connection between da Vinci and the Salvator Mundi. And if there were a duplicate of the Salvator Mundi, we wouldn't feel that way about the duplicate. Okay. Now, you might want to argue that the phrase duplicate of a portrait painted by da Vinci also has a semantic connection with da Vinci. And I would say that's correct. That is correct. But there's more than one kind of magical thinking. There's also homeopathic magic. And I will say that in this case, at least, the magical connection is a little bit weaker. Okay. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. People's judgments of correlation tend to reflect semantic closeness rather than actual perceived correlations. And on to the next slide, please. Epistemic boundedness. This may seem like an unrelated topic, but it very closely pertains to what I'm talking about. Epistemic boundedness is a thesis, the thesis of cognitive closure, or the thesis of epistemic boundedness. I don't know if all of you are familiar with it or not, but it's the thesis that, actually, let's go to the next slide, where we quote Jerry Fodor. I will say that a psychological theory represents the mind as epistemically bounded if it is a consequence of the theory that our cognitive organization imposes epistemically significant constraints on the beliefs that we can entertain. In other words, the structure of the mind prevents us from believing certain things. It's not that we're too rational to believe certain things. It's that the design of the brain prevents us from believing certain things. That's the thesis of epistemic boundedness. And when I spoke of philosophy being difficult or unintuitive, what I had in mind was this. The answers to some philosophical questions may be inaccessible because the structure of the human brain doesn't allow for us to form the answer. Okay? We're not allowed to conceive of the answer because of the structure of our brain. The brain cannot do just anything. It's not an all-purpose device. And so philosophy as it exists today, I don't mean philosophy in ancient Greece, where they were talking about the sun and moon. I don't mean that. But philosophy as it exists today, according to this thesis, represents questions which are humanly unanswerable because of cognitive limitations of the human brain. Okay. Now let's go to the next slide. Let's go. Okay, thank you. This thesis is very much associated with Noam Chomsky. Okay. According to Chomsky, you can't be good at something if you're not bad at something else. Those two things necessarily go together. If you're a great weightlifter, you're going to be a rotten butterfly. So the human brain is very good at acquiring language, and it is capable of doing quantum mechanics. Not the easiest thing to do, but it's capable of doing it. But in all likelihood, there are some things which the human brain cannot do at all. And I'm suggesting that this would be the limit case of unintuitive thinking, even the degenerate case of unintuitive thinking. Now, going on to the next slide, another quote by Chomsky. If you take a cup of coffee with cream swirling around in it, Presumably, all of the natural laws are known, but you can't solve the equations because they're just too complex. So one possibility is that we cannot understand intentionality because intentionality is the result of brain processes that are extremely complicated. They're probably much more complicated than the cream swirling in the coffee, and we just can't figure it out. Okay. Now, I mention intentionality because that pertained to my earlier examples. I was talking about Putnam and Davidson. They were attempting to characterize intentionality at least partly, or at the very least to characterize reference, at least partly. Okay. Not necessarily a full-blown theory of reference, but a partial characterization of reference. And they were using what I believe to be magical thinking, magical contagion. But the reality probably is that we're just not able to understand intentionality. And going on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Another possibility is we lack crucial concepts. It could be not just that what's going on in the brain is too complicated, but we just don't have the right concepts to answer philosophical questions, not only about intentionality, but about the nature of causality, the possibility of a priori knowledge, why radical skepticism is false, and so on. Okay? The problem of universals and all that sort of thing. Okay? We may just not have, we may not be able to form the concepts to formulate the answers to these questions. And that would be epistemic boundedness. Now, to go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Problems versus mysteries, a distinction made by Chomsky. Problems are questions that we have some hope of answering, potentially. Mysteries are questions that we cannot answer. And this is just a matter of definition. If you believe in epistemic boundedness, then you believe in mysteries. If you don't believe in epistemic boundedness, then you don't believe in mysteries. When Wittgenstein said, the riddle does not exist, he was denying the existence of mysteries, and he was denying epistemic boundedness, by the way. And so going on to the next slide, given the thesis of epistemic boundedness, the perennial questions of philosophy would constitute the degenerate case of non-intuitive thinking. So when Dendrad and Schrader were talking about non-intuitive thinking or unintuitive thinking, they were talking about correlational reasoning. And they weren't saying it was impossible. They were just saying it's really hard. Okay. Now, given the thesis of epistemic boundedness, the question, what is intentionality, would not just be a really hard question, it would be an impossible question. A space alien might be able to answer it because their brain is different. But hypothetically, the human brain cannot answer it. And so it would be a degenerate case of non-intuitive thinking. Thinking that is so non-intuitive, it's just flat out impossible. And given what Schrader was saying, that when we encounter non-intuitive thinking, we have a tendency to fall back on magical thinking. What I want to say is that when philosophers encounter the degenerate case of non-intuitive thinking, which they do quite often in their field, given what philosophy is, they tend to fall back on magical thinking. And I only mentioned two philosophers, or maybe three. I also mentioned John Locke. But I only mentioned two or three philosophers, but I would insist that there's a lot of this going on in philosophy. It's not a limited thing. It's quite pervasive. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Magical thinking should be a natural tendency in the face of mysteries. And the word should here is descriptive. I'm saying that magical thinking is a natural tendency in the face of mysteries. And that's why one finds magical thinking in philosophy. Now on to the next slide, please. Bacon, Idols of the Tribe. I want to put this in historical perspective. When I say that there's a lot of magical thinking in the history of philosophy, One time period in which there seems to be less magical thinking is the scientific revolution. There are some exceptions. I consider the idealism of Leibniz and Berkeley to be magical thinking. I consider my own idealism to be magical thinking, in case you're wondering, because I wrote a paper defending idealism once. But however, I think it's striking, it's really striking at how good the philosophers of the scientific revolution were in avoiding magical thinking. They were very good at avoiding it. And this includes Bacon, Descartes, Hume. I'm also going to include Galileo. I'm also going to include Newton, which may surprise you, because some people say, well, Newton was an alchemist. He must have believed in magic. But I'm not so sure about Newton believing in magic. We could talk about that if you're curious. But I do want to say that during the scientific revolution, there was a pretty good tendency to avoid magical thinking. Bacon explicitly identified magical thinking, very explicitly, in more than one of his books, and he was very skeptical of it. He said, I don't believe that that objects attract one another because they have a similar shape. And I don't believe that this root is an aphrodisiac because the root resembles testicles. I mean, he explicitly talks about things like that. Very, very explicitly rejects magical thinking. Galileo, he rejected magical thinking to the point of being a little bit foolish. He refused to believe in the moon theory of the tides because he thought it was magic. So he refused to believe in it. So maybe he was going too far, because evidently the moon does explain the tides. Anyway, though, the idols of the tribe in Bacon, I want to say something about that. The idols of the tribe are innate prejudices. They're not necessarily false, but they are prejudices, and they're potentially misleading. And I want to say that magical thinking is one of the idols of the tribe. Not always misleading, not false by definition, but it is a prejudice. And so it is potentially misleading. And so I think we should be cautious. And on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Magical contagion, philosophical thought must be scrutinized and treated with caution, even if this leaves us with no idea as to how to account for intentionality. And on to the final slide. A quote from another thinker from the scientific revolution, René Descartes. Only those objects should engage our attention to the sure and indubitable knowledge of which our mental powers seem to be adequate. In other words, if Descartes is correct, abandoning the attempt to understand intentionality is better than coming up with magical theories of intentionality if those theories are not reasonable. Okay. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
Okay, you're welcome.
I hope everyone is. I'm having real, very, very much strange. All the different things are happening here on my part, on my end. I don't know if it has anything to do with magical thinking or magical contagion, but there was a lot of interference from, I don't know, some noises, and now the whole thing of projecting the slides wasn't working properly. I'm very sorry about this. I apologize for any.
Well, I didn't realize you were using my slides. I thought you had your own. So what I did was I closed my slides and opened the other ones.
Right. Yeah. But it was perfect. It was a brilliant talk. We are really very grateful. You delivered a very, very interesting, thought-provoking talk. And now we have enough time to raise questions and to start a discussion. Okay, so I don't know if anyone would like to ask a question. or make comments, because otherwise I will start myself. Okay, let me start with a question relating to intentionality, because you mentioned a couple of times, especially thinking of the Twin Earth thought experiment. But I was wondering whether you could elaborate more, John, on this whole thing of calling into question intentionality as a way of making sense of reference semantic. Because usually in philosophy, especially in phenomenology, we almost assume that intentionality is precisely what allows us to establish the right connections in terms of a meaning and the way meaning could be shared among speakers, but also for actions that someone means to do something, someone has intention of carrying out some course of action. So I would like to hear you a little bit more.
Oh, well,
your
by
critique.
intentionality, I simply meant semantics. I meant meaning. I wasn't talking about intentionality in the sense of purposiveness, although I assume purposiveness assumes intentionality, but they're not really the same thing per se. And I was not talking about intentionality in the sense of intention versus extension. I was talking about semantics. So reference is semantics because it's a connection between thought and the world, or connection between language and the world. And that's why I use the word intentionality. And Putnam and Davidson are characterizing semantics, I could say. They're characterizing content, at least partly. They're not giving a complete theory of content, but they're at least partly characterizing content. And it may well be that content is something we don't understand, that we're not able to understand. No one seems to have a satisfactory theory of content. In fact, no one seems to have a satisfactory theory of anything really philosophical, which is one of the arguments for epistemic boundedness.
Right. Yeah. Well, we can get back to those issues. Nicholas, you had your hand raised. Please, Nicholas, go ahead.
Hey, Professor. My name is Nicholas. I'm an engineer and I work with AI safety. And I wish to make a question about magical thinking in AI development. There was like a recent talk where there was this research at NIPS, and he said that machine learning has become alchemy. And it was a great talk. Like everyone who watched loved the talk. And like his argument was that machine learning, because it doesn't have like a solid foundation of like theoretical theorems, like we don't have like strong theorems to guarantee results of like our models are going to do this or that. He said that like much of machine learning research and talk and hype is becoming alchemy, is becoming like some sort of magical thinking. And
well,
the word
hype
that
sounds like dishonesty. Is that what you're saying? That there's some exaggeration?
I don't know.
Exaggeration as to what?
I think, yeah. Exaggeration is a good word. Exaggerate is a perfect word. Hype, So like there's a lot of alchemy going on. And he said like, oh, alchemy is fine if you want like to make.
Now I get the point, because during the Middle Ages, alchemy was all hype.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh, I understand now. Yeah, I got it.
But like his argument was more like was related to safety, because like he said like alchemy is fine if you want like to build a model to like suggest you what pictures you might like, but alchemy is not fine if you're gonna like make a model to decide if like someone is gonna be arrested or not, or like to define the sentence of someone. Then alchemy is not good. Then you want like verifiable methods to know that my model is doing this and this and that. So like I don't know. I was wondering, like, what is your thoughts on magical thinking in like areas like engineering or stuff like that?
In engineering, well, I would hope that there wouldn't
machine
be.
learning engineering.
I
more
was hoping there
specific.
wouldn't be much of it in engineering. I would think, but
There's a lot.
well, I wonder what you mean by magical thinking, though. When you say that there's a lot of magical thinking in engineering, magical thinking, you mean wishful thinking? Is that what you mean?
Maybe yes, or maybe like the idea of using technologies or things that you don't fully understand, like you don't have theorems to prove that they work, but like they kind of work. We think they work, but we don't have ways to prove it. We just have like this hypothesis that like, it works when
Oh, you
tested.
mean something like there's something mysterious going on in artificial intelligence.
Something like that. Yeah, I don't know if that's your definition,
well,
but
I discussed mystery and I
Me too.
discussed magic, but I never meant to equate the two. As
Okay.
far as I'm concerned, mystery and magic are two different things.
Okay.
Mystery means you don't know something. Magic is something we're in the process of defining, and I only characterized one type of magic, namely contagious magic. I didn't characterize any other kinds. There's more than one kind. I wanted to focus the discussion, and I just talked about one kind of magic. Mystery is different. I don't consider mystery to be magic. Mystery, there's no question that there are mysteries, because from the point of view of a dog, there are many genuine mysteries, like how a television set works is a mystery from my point of view, actually, but it's also definitely it's a mystery from the point of view of a dog, right? The dog has no chance of understanding it.
Okay.
So there are mysteries, and even like predicting. Actually, this reminds me of Chomsky's example of the shape of the cream in the coffee. You pour some cream in coffee and you stir it, and it takes a certain shape, and you can't predict the shape that it takes. It's mysterious why it took that shape and not some other shape. But there's no question that mysteries exist. The question as to whether or not magic exists, I think, is a very different question.
Okay.
And I mentioned alchemy briefly in the talk only because I mentioned Newton, and I was anticipating someone perhaps talking about him. But I wasn't. I wasn't saying that mystery and magic are the same thing. Given the way I'm using the terms, they're not the same thing. In fact, magic gives us in a way, they're almost opposite, because magic gives us the illusion that we understand something.
I got it.
And mystery is like, I have no idea what's going on.
Okay. Now I like your definitions. Now I got it better. Okay.
So I understand why this handkerchief heals people. It's because the Apostle Paul touched it. So I understand. But that's in contrast to mystery, where you don't understand anything. It's like I just don't get it.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answer. That was really good. And it was a really good talk.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay, William.
Thank you, Professor, for the talk.
You're welcome.
I'm sorry if I'm going a bit tangential, because I work with social sciences. So my interest was in magical thinking. That I don't know if you know the work of Michael Walzer.
I don't think so. Walzer doesn't sound familiar.
So he has a three-part scheme on critique that it's discovery, invention, and interpretation. So this is a scheme that he has on to kind of analytically dispose the process of critique. So discovery is something like a certain religious or metaphysical experience that supports the condition for criticism. And invention, it's when criticism takes a starting point, a real or fictitious general affirmation for production of normativity. So where do you see, or if it is, or if magical thinking has a place in that scheme, or where does it fit?
Does this scheme have anything to do with Kekulé and the benzene ring?
I don't know.
But this scheme you're talking about, does it have anything to do with scientific discovery?
Yeah, social criticism.
Social criticism.
Yeah, it's a.
Well, okay, it's something I'm not familiar with, but your question reminds me of something. I'm not sure how relevant it is to your question, but it reminds me of the fact that in philosophy of science, there's a distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification. In other words, how a scientist comes up with an idea is a very different matter from how the scientist evaluates the idea. And I don't wish to deny that magical thinking might be a good source of inspiration. It might be a good source of ideas, and which could then later be criticized, subject to criticism. And if some of those theories survive criticism, they could turn out even to be good ideas. So I suppose one possibility would be the idea that disease, in some cases, is transmitted by contact and is not the result of demonic possession. And this could have begun as magical thinking, but it withstood criticism and it was refined. And over the course of time, it led to the germ theory of disease, which is true, of course. So magical thinking could conceivably play a role in a rational process leading toward a true theory.
So just a tiny follow-up. I think that it does fit, but you talk about a lot about history, and I think history has a very tight connection with you mean about the transference, the magical transference. I don't know if that's the specific word that you used, but can this magical apprehension be forged? If you say that the painting is Modigliani, does it have the same magical apprehension? It
depends on whether or not you believe in magic. When it comes to Modigliani and Leonardo da Vinci and artists, when it comes to artists, we act like we all believe in magic. I know there may be a few people out there who don't feel this way. There may be a few people out there who say, I don't care if Da Vinci painted it or not. All that matters is what it looks like. I suppose there are some people who say that. But it seems like many people in the world, maybe even a majority of people in the world, act like they believe in magical contagion when it comes to works of art. They act like it really matters whether or not a famous person created this painting as opposed to somebody else. And it's difficult for me to say whether that's rational or irrational. I think from the point of view of a space alien, it might look really irrational. I hope you can still hear me. I put the microphone down. I put the headphones down because they're actually muffling what I hear, because your voice is not coming from the headphones. But anyway, space aliens might come down to visit us, and they might say it's ridiculous that we care so much as to whether Modigliani painted this painting or Dehori painted it. Why do we care? It's the same type of painting. A space alien might just be completely flabbergasted by this. But to most human beings, I think it makes a difference. So we tend to think magically on this topic, and it's so deeply ingrained in our culture that it almost sounds strange to say that it's wrong. In a way, it does seem rational, and it does seem reasonable to spend thousands of dollars to investigate a painting to see who actually painted it.
I think that's not the thing about humans or a species trait, more of a cultural, social, the weight of history, maybe. Because
well, magical contagion is found throughout many different cultures, including pre-literate cultures. In fact, the classic literature on magical thinking is, well, in the very first quote, they mentioned 19th century anthropologists, principally John Tyler and James Fraser, and they were talking about quote unquote primitive people. And so, and also there was Marcel Mauss and Henri Hubert and Bronislaw Malinowski, and all of them were studying primarily pre-literate peoples. And that's where the initial information came from, pre-literate cultures. And so magical contagion is people in pre-literate cultures, they believe in magical contagion. And it's very easy to say that they're irrational for believing in it. But then we find something similar in the art world, in our own culture. And it's hard for us to say that it's irrational. It somehow seems not only rational, but extremely elite. The complete opposite of primitive. Okay. Okay, I think there's another question.
Yeah, okay, Paulo. You're going to raise a question, Paulo? Well, if he's not around, Nuno is next in line.
Okay.
Professor, thank you for your talk.
You're welcome.
I'm just wondering, when you talked about correlation and its relation with the statistics and probability, and I was wondering if statistical correlations are also providers of meaning. Every relationship we make, and this goes back to Professor Nitamar's question. Every relationship we make with something is pervaded with meaning. It's in some way it's a correlation. Statistical correlations are only different because they somehow are closer to when they are more significant, which we say they are more significant. They are closer to what we deem to be the truth. I would argue that without attempting to debunk modern science, that, for instance, Bacon, that you referred in your talk, is also a victim of magical thinking when he says that science is the purpose of science and scientific and in our relationship with nature is to improve the human condition. And that is not a statistical probability, I think, in the sense that it's pretty significant. It's something he says to guide the scientific practice, but we could say today that even though it has improved some of the human condition, it endangered other humans and other parts of the human condition. So what I want to say is that there perhaps the distinction between magical thinking and scientific thinking or something like that, maybe it's not that precise or that stark. I think that's the word, and it's maybe more a spectrum of things. And I guess you spoke, you mentioned Feyerabend and I think also Kuhn and other thinkers like those.
I think I mentioned Feyerabend for being very pro-Aristotelian. Yeah.
Yeah, in the beginning.
Along with Putnam.
But my question is that I think there are providers. Every correlation is a provider of meaning, and there is no substantial difference, at least for me, between a correlation per se and a statistical correlation. Besides what you put as being more or less meaningful. And in the case of modern sciences, what is meaningful, substantially meaningful, is the improvement of the human condition, generally speaking. So I don't think there is such a divide between the two modes of thinking. One, I even ask myself if one should be considered magical thinking. There is only, I think, two different approaches to meaningfulness, and one of those has maybe a more precise notion of what being meaningful is in the case of sciences, for instance.
When it comes to Bacon, I can say something which I'm hoping might be relevant. I know that according to Bertrand Russell's interpretation of Francis Bacon, Bacon adhered to a doctrine of double truth. In other words, there were at least two different truths with two different logics. There's religious truth, and I don't know specifically what the logic of religious truth would be. I think for Bacon it would be the Bible, but then I think you would have to acknowledge that there could be more than one religious logic because there's more than one religion. But for science, the logic of science is Baconian method. And so there are two different games, so to speak, with different rules. There's the religious game and there's the scientific game, which Bacon would have called philosophical. And Bacon's claim that that science exists for the sake of improving the human condition had a religious motivation. It was because of the commandment for charity that we're supposed to improve the human condition. And so even though there's a doctrine of double truth in Bacon, at least according to Russell's interpretation of Bacon, even though there's a doctrine of double truth in Bacon, the two truths complement each other because religion provides the ethical motivation for science. And expanding science indefinitely can lead to the detriment to the human condition. It can lead to like nuclear bombs and climate change and all sorts of things like that. And this may just show that that Bacon was a little bit too much of a utopian, that he thought that there could be just one possible solution. No, I'm not sure what else to say. When talking about magic, I tried to keep like very focused on just one kind of magical thinking, magical contagion. And I mentioned religion, and I mentioned magical thinking in religion, but I didn't mean to imply that religion is magical thinking. I didn't say that. If religion is magical thinking, it would have to be a cluster of different kinds of magical thinking, because it's not all magical contagion, obviously. So if you were thinking that there's some magical thinking in Bacon because he was religious, and it's inseparable from his philosophy of science, which it is actually, it is really, because religion is what provides the motivation for doing science. If you were going to say that, I don't think that's the same as saying that there's magical thinking in Bacon. I don't think that his being a truth pluralist is quite the same as saying that he believed in magic. Unless perhaps you're going to say that he so deeply believed in the Bible, which he obviously did. He so deeply believed in the Bible that he believed in things like the healing power of Paul's apron and that sort of thing.
No, my point was just that I don't see how, if we deprive science from that kind of horizon, how do we justify the difference between a correlation that is taken almost as a cause and effect relation, because I think that's the intention of scientific thought, and what you deem to be magical thinking? There is a kind of correlation whose probability is very, very, very low. That's my point. That's why I think that it's obvious that Bacon's proposal and, well, its influence over Western science even today, it's based on his beliefs, on his religious beliefs, and namely on the charity principle. But I'm asking, what I think is that they are not, they are analytically separable, but they are not, they are intertwined. And that is the case. I think that is also the case in most science today, or in the scientific thought even today, when we talk about what is a scientifically successful experience, something that produces effects. What are those effects for? Something useful for mankind, or something able to be used for something else? So I think there's some kind of magical thinking that it's always necessary to magical thinking. Well, I don't know if you would define it like that. At least not scientific thinking. That is necessary to guide the scientific efforts, and that's my question. My question is, where do we draw the line? Because it's not clear to me that the difference whether either we fall on the classical cause and effect notion, or we just draw a spectrum, and it's very difficult to draw the line between magical and scientific thought, because what was yesterday we spoke of phlogiston, and I think that's how we say it in English, and things like that. So I don't know where we draw the line between these things, and that is my only issue with it.
Well, where we draw the line between magical thinking and thinking that's not magical. I just did my best to make the conception of magical thinking as narrow and clear as possible. And I can see how in the germ theory of disease, there might be some question as to where we draw the line between magical thinking and scientific thinking, because prior to the discovery of microbes, the closest analog to the germ theory of disease would have been a form of magical thinking. The only thing I can think of in relation to what you're talking about is the germ theory of disease. It was, at some point in history, there was something that was magical thinking pretty clearly. And even though it was magical thinking, it was closer to good science than anything else would have been.
That's the issue. That's precisely the issue. What is good science, and how? Because that depends on the context, and the context is pervaded with magical thinking. So what is the influence of that magical thinking in good science in a given context? That's my issue with it. That's why for me it's not a clear-cut distinction. In fact, I'm not, as I said, I'm not trying to debunk modern science. I just think that the distinction is not very clear, at least for me. I think I know that science is all about significant correlations and so on, but those correlations are related to criteria, and those criteria are selected by humans, and humans, as you said, have epistemic boundedness. So that in that epistemic boundedness, some of that we can isolate and we can identify, but some of it we cannot. So it pervades our scientific thought. So I don't see how, I see how you can, for instance, say that, well, germ theory is magical thinking. I see that. What
historically,
I don't see is historically, yeah, but
I wouldn't call it that now. No.
Yeah, but what I don't see, it's almost epistemologically. How do you make a clear cut between those things?
Well, one thing I even tried to emphasize in the talk is that I don't necessarily think that magical thinking is always irrational. I don't think it's obvious that it's always irrational. One thing I wanted to do is call attention to the fact that there is so much magical thinking in philosophy, because I don't think philosophers are aware of this. I think philosophers are just doing their thing with no awareness of it. They're familiar with epistemic boundedness. Philosophers will talk about that. That's a big topic in philosophy. But the idea that because of epistemic boundedness, we tend to fall back on magical thinking, that's a concept that I think that hardly any philosophers have familiarity with. And I think it's something they should be more familiar with. At the very least, it would cause us to be more cautious in some of our theorizing. It's not the same thing as a refutation. It's not the same thing as saying, oh, Putnam is wrong. Content is not externalistically constituted. It's not the same thing as saying that. But it is the same thing as saying we should be cautious in how we reach our conclusions, because we appear to be influenced by something here that's non-rational. In some cases, it could be rational. In some cases, irrational. But it's inherently non-rational. We're being influenced by an idol of the tribe, which is not always a bad thing, because the idols of the tribe don't always mislead you. I disagree with people who refer to the idols as false idols, because they're not necessarily false. They're just dangerous. And I mentioned the idols of the tribe specifically and not the other three idols, because the idols of the tribe have to do with being biologically innate, which is what I understand magical thinking to be, because you find it in every culture. And I believe, along with Schrader, that it's a result of the language faculty. I think it's a result of the structure of language that we think magically. But all I'm saying is we have to be careful. We should be careful. And we should be aware of where these ideas are coming from, because when you're aware of where they're coming from, you might not, when you're aware of where these intuitions are coming from, I'll put it that way, when you're aware of where the twin earth intuitions are coming from, you might be a little bit more suspicious of them and not so confident that they're correct. And that's actually my point. I also think we should be more diligent in looking for magical thinking in philosophy. I could have given completely different examples today and not mentioned Putnam or Davidson, because I have before. I have before.
Thanks. It's clearer to me now. Thank you.
Well, it's about caution. I mean, the really important word is caution.
All right, thank you, John. Pedro, you go next.
Thank you. I'd first like to thank the professor for the brilliant talk. I'd just like to say also that this subject is something that I'm really interested in, and I'm happy to see more people within this sphere, let's say, talking about it. You know, several times you mentioned about how you were getting to the philosophical part. To me, everything you said was pretty much philosophical. I can see the ramifications of everything and how they would affect philosophy in several ways. I have two things to say. I just, first of all, I like to pose a question, which is, when you talk about magical thinking, wouldn't it be more precise to maybe treat it as symbolical thinking or mythological thinking, in the sense that, it seems to me that there's a strong connection between what you are calling magical thinking and a psychological phenomenon, which happens very frequently throughout history, as you said. So, for example, I really like psychology. I read a lot about psychology, and there are many authors who talk about how there's even though in mythology and wait, is there a problem?
I didn't say anything.
I'm not sure I still have a bit.
Professor Nitamar, is everything all right? Well, I suppose everyone else still hears me?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, all right. So what I was trying to say is that there's a long list of myths and religions and several examples. I know you said that religion isn't exactly necessarily magical thinking, but I think there's some magical thinking involved within the beliefs that bases several types of religion. And
oh, there's magical thinking in religion. That's one of the first things I said.
well, I'm sorry. I arrived a little bit later. I think I
Okay.
lost the first 5 minutes or so. So I'm
Oh,
sorry
okay.
about that. But so the first question is just, how would you, what are your thoughts about this dichotomy between psychology and philosophy and, magical thinking? Because what I'm trying to say is, I think that I agree with you when you say that, many philosophers make this mistake of using magical thinking in situations where it should be used with a lot more, a lot more carefully. And I think, and that's why me personally, I'm very interested in using philosophy for the study of the mind, within a certain context, because I think that magical thinking is something that is essentially human, and that it's not a lie, as you said, it's not necessarily illogical, but it's something that partakes in the study of something that's not precisely the exterior world. It's how we humans see things and how our psychological mind tries to, it tries to make sense of the things that we don't understand. And by doing so, even if the results aren't exactly scientific, they can tell a lot about how our mind works. And, I think that's very, very interesting aspect of this kind of thinking. And that's
it would be a big shock to philosophers to learn that their work is being studied in order to understand how their minds are working. They want their work to be studied for other reasons.
No, sure. I'm not trying to.
Yeah.
I know I'm not trying to get my colleagues very angry at me here. I'm sorry if I did, but what I'm trying to say is, it's like you. It's not that all magical thinking is necessarily wrong or useless, even in the exterior context. What I'm saying is that I think that, as you said, people should be very careful when using this kind of thinking, because in many cases, it's not necessarily the most efficient form of, the most efficient method to arriving at conclusions in certain aspects. Anyway, that's just my first point. And the second point is more of a direct question. So
all right.
It's, at the same time that I said all that, I'm also very skeptical in nature. So when you mentioned the example about the paintings, the first thing that came to my mind is that I don't see how that has to necessarily be seen as magical thinking. And I'm going to explain why that's the first thing that came to mind. And it's because while I understand what you meant, and I see how it could be perceived as magical in the sense that there's an essence, or there's the perception of an essence being transferred from someone to something, at the same time, I think that there's a bit of, there's a sense of historical continuity going on. So, for example, if an author paints a very important work of art, for example, and then someone goes and copies that work, even though aesthetically speaking, they might be very similar, one of them has a connection with a history of that individual, which is, important to people. For example, Leonardo da Vinci, if someone made a replica of one of his works, aesthetic isn't the only thing that gives it value, as you said yourself. So it seems like if someone made a replica, it's not so much that there is no essence of Da Vinci in the work. It seems like there is no connection between the work and the history of that character, which is important to our culture. And for example, the thing that came to my mind is like when paleontologists studies dinosaurs remains or footprints or bones, if someone made a replica of a dinosaur footprint and compared it to a real one, a scientist would clearly state, well, I'm not interested in the replica because there's no connection between the replica and the thing that I'm trying to study, which is the dinosaur, which existed long before the replica was made. So
I don't understand that. I don't understand that. I think the scientists would be interested in the replica, because if it really is a replica, and I'm using replica in a really strong sense, like molecule for molecule duplicate, right?
Okay.
Absolute copy, a perfect copy. If it really is a replica, it would contain all the same information as the original. So I don't know why the scientist would say they're not interested.
Okay. So it's
I think they would be.
Okay, I understand. I think my question then it's a bit different, but it's still valid, but we're treating the word replica in different ways. But to me, the question remains in the sense that I agree with what you said, but to a replica of that type to exist, it seems it could be, in theory, but it's hard to me to understand how could that exist within a practical sense, like in the painting, for example. Even if a painter creates a replica of the painting, it's not going to be molecule by molecule. And I think that's important because I think that's why someone else would not see the same value as the painting created by Da Vinci. For example, I mean, because of the historical context, as I said, because even if there is a replica, it will not have been created within the same, space, time, and coming from the same mind, which is the mind of this historical character, which we're trying to study. I mean, you could say that maybe there's a replica created by a replica Da Vinci in some alternate Earth, which, could be an interesting hypothesis. But to me, it's kind of difficult to understand this, because it seems like, we, in the practical sense, when someone sees a painting of one of these characters, which is known throughout history, they're making a very strong connection with this mind of this person. And, whatever he created, even if there is no essence of himself in the painting, still, it seems like that thing was created by that character in that time, in that place. I'm having a little trouble understanding what exactly that means.
Well, I think you're emphasizing how important magical contagion is in the art world, and you're giving your own expression of how important it is what it sounds like.
Okay, I see that. I'm not entirely against that conclusion.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I disagree. It seems to me that, yes, maybe it is rational to care about that in the art world, to care whether or not Da Vinci himself actually painted it. One thing I found ironic about the Salvator Mundi was that there was this period of time, there was a certain space of time in which the experts were all agreed as to what they were looking at. They were all agreed as to what the painting looked like, but they couldn't agree as to how much of it was painted by Da Vinci, whether it was 10% or 95% or what. And so during that period of time, it seemed like the value of the painting, not the amount that it actually sold for, which is very high, but the true value of the painting was very, very unclear, because the provenance of the painting was very unclear. And I found this to be very striking and very ironic, because you would think that the painting just is what it is, regardless of where it came from. And yet, at the same time, I recognize that it seems right to care about the provenance. It's an important part of our culture. And just as maybe in some other cultures where they snip off a piece of a person's hair and run away with it, and then they cast a hex on the person using their hair, that maybe in some sense that's rationally defensible. There is something rational about that, after all, within the context of that culture, because that's also magical contagion, or it's supposed to be. We didn't give too many examples of magical contagion from so-called primitive sources, other than the religious ones. But so I agree that, yes, it's not obviously irrational to treat the provenance of a painting like it really matters. It really determines the value of the painting. My main point is that I want people to be aware of how much magical thinking there is in philosophy. And in this talk, I couldn't possibly succeed because there's not enough time. And I only mentioned 2 philosophers. But I would like for people to be more aware of the extent of magical thinking in philosophy, and for them to reflect on what this says about philosophy and what this also says about the human mind.
Well, thank you. I just like to close by saying that I understand what you meant. The overall point, I agree with pretty much, the final conclusion. I'm not sure if my colleagues agree, but I can see what you mean.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, John. Now, Cynthia has a question.
Hi, Professor. Congratulations,
yes,
your talk.
Thank you.
I'm a judge, retired, but judged. My mindset always the judge, and also I'm law teacher.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about the magical thing, but the philosophy's life is important to law application. And I studying about the making decision, and it seems the magical things is or are without control to mathematical values in machine learning. And complicated more the bias influence in the making the decision. I would like to hear your opinion about these questions. Thank you.
Oh, about whether magical thinking is biasing our inferences, biasing our judgments. I think it does in philosophy. I think magical thinking does bias our judgments in philosophy, which is basically my point, in fact. And then I would qualify that by saying that a bias is not always, it does not always lead to error. And that was my point in quoting, not quoting, but my point in referencing Bacon. This is a bias. It's an innate bias, and it's innate because language is innate. And magical thinking is a byproduct of language, in my opinion. And we have this bias because of our language. We tend to associate verbal expressions that are semantically close, and then we tend to infer that things in the world that correspond to those verbal expressions are also somehow connected, are also somehow linked together. So, and this is because of the innateness of the language faculty.
Yeah, yes, and about the without control with formulations, math formulations in machine learning, making decision through machine learning. What about this?
Machine learning, you would have to tell me what you mean by that. It sounds like something that's not being done by people. I suppose that machine learning would be free from magical thinking. I would guess, because it's not human, unless there's something analogous to the language faculty in the machines that's creating an analogous effect. Are you suggesting that machine learning is less biased? than human learning? Ah, well, okay. Machine learning may be less biased than human learning. I don't think that we can program machines to do science, though, because we can't formulate scientific method. We can't formulate scientific method as a single algorithm. And if we could do that, then we would be able to teach machines to do science. But we can't. And we have a capacity for doing science, which makes it possible for us to make progress in these problems. We're able to make progress in problems because of our capacity to do science. We do not seem to have a philosophical capacity. We seem to be lacking a philosophical capacity and as human beings. And because we lack the philosophical capacity, we have this tendency to think magically and then call it philosophy.
Yes, Profs, I agree with you. This is a problem. The bias, the human being, the programmate, the algorithm. This is problem. The orange of everything. Thank you a lot.
You're welcome.
John, if you allow me to ask another question, because Bianca just mentioned here the Chinese room argument by Searle. And I was wondering, in your overall presentation, in your approach to magical thinking, whether you could address what David Hume called relations of ideas, because it seems that both for Putnam's and Searle's thought experiments, we may think of Davidson's experiments as well. It seems that there is always the problem with a reference semantic, or the problem of a reference involved here. But my question is, I could see and follow your arguments in terms of magical thinking relating to matters of fact or to the way we approach reality, let's say. But in Humean terms, would you say that you cannot apply magical thinking to relations of ideas or to a priori statements, for instance? How would you respond to that?
Well, I'm not sure what that means, that I cannot apply magical thinking to analytic truths.
Right.
I'm not exactly sure what that means. You could well, the only thing that comes to mind in response to the issues you're raising is this idea that Wittgenstein seemed to indicate in his remarks on Fraser's Golden Bough, where he talks about magical thinking. And he seems to think that in some cases, magical thinking could be treated as grammar. In other words, it could be treated as logic. And you could just stipulate it to be true. I suppose that's what that means. You could just stipulate it to be true, in which case it would have no empirical content at all, and no one would expect it to have any empirical content. Now, I don't know if that's the kind of thing you had in mind or not.
Exactly. Exactly. For instance,
that is what you had in mind. Well, okay,
yes,
so
precisely. Yes, exactly.
Okay, so you could just understand. So in other words, there are two different ways of understanding magical thinking. You could understand it as being substantive and being about the world, which is what I take the magical thinking in Davidson and Putnam to be intended to be. It's actually about the world. These are actual characterizations of reference, actual characterizations of how we think and how we talk. But you could also sometimes construe magical thinking as just being a matter of fiat, as being like the rules of logic, as being a priori, as being part of our form of life or something like that. And in that case, I would make a connection back to this doctrine of double truth that I mentioned in regard to Bertrand Russell and Francis Bacon. According to Bertrand Russell, Bacon adhered to a doctrine of double truth. There's the truth of religion, and then there's the truth of science or philosophy, and they're just two different games. I say games because he was talking about rules. You know, Baconian method involves rules, right? So two different games. And Wittgenstein noted that analogously, there are two different ways of understanding religion. You could understand religion as being empirical, in which case it's bad science. Or you could understand religion as being a priori, in which case it's more like some kind of logic or some kind of form of life or something like that. And I'm sure, especially given Wittgenstein's discussion of Fraser, not only in remarks on the Golden Bough, but also in his lectures, I'm sure that Wittgenstein would have said something like that about magical thinking. There are two different ways of understanding magical thinking, and they're both correct because you can find both of them in people's minds. There's magical thinking, which is applied to the world, and it's a kind of science. And it's dangerous because it could easily be wrong. And then there's another kind of magical thinking where it's all kind of like, I don't want to say pretend, but it's all just a matter of grammar. It's a priori. And it reminds me of this this book. Like, oh, what's the name of it? I can't recall the name of it now. I think it's called The Witch's Craft or something like that. It's a book about people in England, like 20th century or 21st century England, who are practicing witchcraft. And many of them, when challenged, they would give a kind of Wittgensteinian defense. They would say, well, this is just a form of life. It's just like a language game we're playing. These are just, it's like relations of ideas and that sort of thing. So I suppose that this approach to magical thinking is possible. I don't know, empirically speaking, I don't know how common it is. I suspect that in real life, that approach to magical thinking is very refined and rare, even though Wittgenstein wanted to say that it was very common.
Fantastic.
So that's what I can think of to say to that. So.
All right. Thank you so much, John. Well,
you're welcome.
Anyone else? I don't know, Paulo. Paulo, would you like to ask your question now? Do you have a connection? No, Paulo is gone. All right. Anyone else? Still have enough time for questions?
I have one that is related with my previous question, but I think it's better formulated in my mind, at least. How do you do? Well, for what I could understand, your position is one of a relative skepticism, or as a method to approach knowledge and science and thinking as in general. If we are epistemically bounded, how do we know that scientific thought is not in itself magical thinking?
It's not magical thinking because it's usually not magical thinking because it usually doesn't fit any of the definitions of magical thinking. Magical thinking is divided into types: homeopathic magic, word magic, allopathic magic, and magical contagion. And most of science doesn't really fit into any of those categories. And as far as I'm concerned, that's why it's not magical thinking, or not normally magical thinking.
Oh, okay.
But I think what you mean is, how do we know that it's not completely wrong?
Okay.
I think it's what you.
I didn't understand it was related to previous definitions. Okay, then okay.
I only focus on one definition.
On the more on the human experience of knowing and thinking, more in general, and not to previous definitions of what is and what isn't magical thinking. So okay,
I only focused on one definition because I wanted to focus. I know that this topic is so gigantic, you have to like focus on very specific things if you're only going to be speaking for a couple hours. And so that's why I only talked about magical contagion. But there's also homeopathic magic, which you find all over the place in Greek philosophy. Homeopathic magic, like to like knows like, as Empedocles said. Like is attracted to like, as Democritus said. You see, there's even magical thinking in Democritus. Like perceives like, as Plotinus evidently believed. And this kind of thinking is implicit in Aristotle's theory of perception, which is why I earlier referred to Aristotle as very magical. And then there's allopathic magic, which is the opposite. It's the relation between contraries. Contrary knows contrary, like in Heraclitus. Contrary is drawn to contrary. Contrary knows contrary. Contrary affects contrary. Contrary causes contrary. Then there's word magic, which is that words cause things, as in magical spells and formulae. And I believe that there's actually a lot of word magic in philosophy, which is, I think that may be the most shocking thing of all, but it would take a while to explain it. But I also believe that I believe that idealism is a kind of word magic. The idea that the thought is the thing is essentially equivalent to saying that the word guarantees its referent. When Wittgenstein in the Tractatus said that the name guarantees its referent, I take this to be a kind of word magic. Not contagion, but word magic. So there are different kinds of magic, and you can find, and once you realize that, I mean, like, we don't have time to talk about all of that, right? But once you realize that, you can notice all sorts of magical thinking in philosophy. It was especially, philosophy was openly magical before the scientific revolution. Philosophers would use the word magic. They would try to explain it metaphysically. The medieval philosopher Al-Kindi tried to explain magic metaphysically in terms of star rays, and Plotinus had a similar theory. And it wasn't until the scientific revolution that the word magic became taboo. But with the scientific revolution, science and philosophy began to separate and become distinct gradually, because certain parts of philosophy became progressive with the revolution, and other parts of philosophy remained non-progressive. The non-progressive parts you continue to call philosophy. The progressive parts we call science. And the non-progressive parts, once it became clear that they were distinct from science, then I believe that magical thinking enters mainly as a conscious influence, because philosophers are not using magic like they used to. They're not like Marsilio Ficino or Pico della Mirandola, who were Plotinus, who were using this word openly. They don't use the word openly anymore. And it's not because it's a dirty secret. It's because they don't know that they're thinking magically. They're doing it unconsciously.
Yeah, this was very clear in your talk. I understood this is overall, it's very much Wittgenstein's suspicion, which is raised against philosophizing overall, that most philosophers are almost assuming that they are so clear and that they know what they are talking about. They don't bother to review their own magical thinking or magical contagion in their arguments. Yeah, that's a very interesting point.
Well, I want to make it clear that Wittgenstein was very much against this notion of
All right.
epistemic boundedness.
Yeah, okay.
He did not believe in that at all.
Right.
So when I say that magical thinking is a natural response to mystery, that's not a Wittgensteinian thing to say.
Okay.
I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, and again, because you were opposing mysteries to problems, right?
Well, that's Chomsky's distinction, but yes, I was.
Yeah, you refer to Chomsky, but we can find this in other authors who tend to say that, wow, philosophers are, dealing with problems, while theologians are dealing with mysteries. But as you said, many philosophers talk about mysteries. Like we can think of Daniel Dennett's, takes on the mystery of consciousness, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Although Dennett also denies epistemic boundedness. He doesn't believe in it either. He's more Wittgensteinian on that point.
All right.
Yeah. The philosophers who believe in epistemic boundedness, perhaps the most famous one was Immanuel Kant.
All right. Yes.
There's the Ding an sich.
Yeah.
And we'll never know what it is. So the distinction is Kantian in a way. Chomsky loves to point to his predecessors. So he points out how Konrad Lorenz had a similar distinction. And very indirectly, Jakob von Uexküll. He doesn't mention Uexküll by name, but he keeps using the word Umwelt.
Mm-hmm.
And so whenever Chomsky says Umwelt, he's talking about Uexküll. There's nobody else who uses that word, right? So there's a distinction between problems and mysteries in Uexküll in the sense that we are limited by our Umwelt. We can't go beyond it. We might be able to create a new Umwelt, but if we do that in science, we can create a new Umwelt. But when we do that, it's just one more Umwelt. We can't get beyond all of the Umwelt and find the Ding an sich. That's Uexküll. And Chomsky clearly agrees with that. And he uses the word Umwelt quite a lot without mentioning Uexküll's name for some reason. I don't know why.
That's extremely interesting, John. This is very, very, very interesting to think of Umwelt in this sense. Yeah. Anyone else? I don't know. Guys, would you like to raise more questions or comments to Professor Bolender? Well, okay, guys, we want to thank Professor John Bolender once again for this marvelous presentation and this very, very much engaging discussion on magical thinking. Let's remind everyone that this coming week, well, actually starting tomorrow, we have the academic week of our graduate program in philosophy, Semana Académica. So everyone is invited to closely follow all the presentations online. We'll be also launching an international symposium on justice starting next Monday, the 20th at 2 p.m. So we're going to be very busy these 2 weeks with 2 major events in our graduate program. John, thanks again. Would you like to say anything else to finish?
Oh, no, just thank you very much for the opportunity for speaking. I'm very grateful.
Well, we are the ones who are very grateful to you, John. So guys, take care. Enjoy the rest of your week. Good work and keep the faith.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.